The earliest account we have of the resurrection of Jesus is found in the 15th chapter of Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. You might do well today, before you read the paper, or turn on the Masters to read it. It's a quick read. It is important. A few phrases from that chapter. If Christ was not raised, your faith has nothing in it. What would have been the point of my suffering at Ephesus? If it is for this life only that Christ has given us hope, we are of all people most miserable. Those who have died within Christ's fellowship are utterly lost. But the truth is, Christ was raised to life. And so in Christ, all will be brought to life. Thanks be to God. Have you heard the General Motors OnStar ads? A woman in the middle of nowhere and an emergency comes up and she pushes her OnStar button and there's an immediate answer from the heavens via a satellite. Locked out, we'll unlock your car right now over the airwaves. Flat tire, we know exactly who to call and they'll be there as fast as the tow truck can get there. And by the way, we know exactly what tire you have on that car, so there'll be an exact replacement when you arrive. Need directions anywhere? It doesn't matter whether it's a restaurant or a hospital, just stay on the line and we'll tell you when and where to turn. Even in the smallest way, your future is in good hands with GM. Now there's a GM of a God for you. Always at the ready to reach down from the ether, focus on you and your needs, protect you, guide you, take care of you. And that's the God they really wanted back then. If he is the Messiah of God, let him come down from that cross and save himself, and not incidentally us as well. And instinctively, isn't that really what we would like to have of him? What's the point of a God if he doesn't rearrange our world a little bit to our advantage, reward us for our efforts to live upright lives? How often over the years have I heard someone say in the face of a premature dying, such a good person, how could God let this happen? So the first thing to be said on this bright Easter morning is that the GM God is not the God we get in Jesus of Nazareth. This is why they were not disposed to believe that he had survived death. In this over-psychologized era, some of the intellectual elite on this day will inevitably suggest that the resurrection was simply wish fulfillment on the part of his grieving friends. They couldn't tolerate the thought that he'd gone down to destruction, and so they willed him alive again. But that's not at all fair to the story. As the English scholar N.T. Wright puts it, they knew as well as we do that things like that just don't happen. When people died, they stayed dead in first century Palestine just as much as they stayed dead in the technological 21st century. Jesus' followers weren't expecting him to die in the first place, and when he did, they certainly weren't expecting him to rise again. Yet they say loud and clear that that is what happened. He had gone through death and out the other side into a new mode of human existence. The stories they tell about meeting him are mostly quite breathless and artless. They're mostly much more like quick eyewitness sketches with the details not even tidied up than like carefully drawn portraits. All the accounts suggest that the early Christians were as puzzled by this as we are. But they're still quite clear that it happened. It wasn't a corporate hallucination. It wasn't a grief-induced fantasy. It wasn't just a matter of him having lived on in their memory. It was for real. So the story of this day works this way. It's not something you can prove in distant objectivity. It's only something that can be embraced in all its craziness and then lived from in our brief days here. In faith, we can dare to live as if it were true. And when we do, we find it changes everything else. If we start with trust in the story, we discover that all sorts of good things happen to us by way of health and courage and hope and love of one another, by way of renewed enthusiasm for this life. The certainty of the story rests indeed on how it changes us here and now as we give ourselves over to it. First of all, it changes the face of suffering. Suffering like that of the Good Friday cross. The suffering of Jesus was not unusual. Crosses were all over the place, and they but epitomized the pains and agonies of life in that kind of world. Do I say that kind of world? Read Bosnia, read Iraq, read the morning paper. The suffering of Jesus was not unusual. Everybody knew what it meant, though. It meant the absence of Almighty God. And isn't this almost instinctual with all of us? I mean, life sails along, everything is right with our world, at least our personal world, and then out of nowhere we're blindsided by accident or disease, and we find ourselves shut out of life, and we do wonder, where on earth is God? Why does he let this happen to me? You see, we experience our sufferings and troubles as the absence of God in our world. And so did they. His friends had hoped right up to the last minute that God was with him, on his side, would use him to lift the yoke of foreign occupation, would turn the corner toward health and prosperity and future. They were arguing right up to the last minute about who would have seats in the cabinet of the new regime. But God had let Jesus down, and no less had let them down. Nothing about their mindset even remotely suggested that something else was going on there on that hill. So the experiences of him alive beyond the grave, once they got over their astonishment, worked a kind of Copernican revolution in their heads. What had appeared 3 days before as the absence of their God, desertion by their God, now looked quite different. They saw it, the truth that right there in the suffering and pain on Golgotha, the Almighty was powerfully present in love, sharing the very miseries of human existence and granting this Jesus the strength to go through it all with courage and faith. So the resurrection changes the face of suffering. It does not say that God delivers us from the suffering of this life. And that's a hard word, especially for a people dedicated to pain avoidance, dedicated to the highest possible level of pleasure and comfort and security. But the word says that when it does come, the struggle, the failure, the misery, the pain, as it surely does to all of us, God is still there to take us through it. He shares our sufferings and so changes its faith. Writes the apostle, I can face whatever comes through him who gives me strength. Trevor Beeson stood at the high altar of Westminster Abbey to celebrate the marriage of his daughter Catherine to Anthony, aged 23. 9 months later, he stood before the same altar at Anthony's funeral, who was killed when his car ran into a wall in East London. 4 months later, Trevor returned to the altar beside the coffin of his friend, Earl Mountbatten, who died when his fishing boat was blown to pieces by Irish terrorists. Reflecting on the experience, he writes, I should find it impossible to believe in and worship a God who arranged for the great servants of the community to be blown up on their holidays, who deliberately turned a young man's car into a brick wall. This is not the God of love whose ways are revealed in Jesus of Nazareth. There are two insights that have helped me cope with these tragedies and look beyond them. The first is that although God is not responsible for causing tragedy, he is not a detached observer of our suffering and misery. On the contrary, he is immersed in it with us, sharing to the full our particular grief and pain, and that is the meaning of the cross. Second, although we naturally ask, why did it happen? I've discovered that the more important question is, what are we going to make of it? Every tragedy contains within it the seeds of resurrection. And this is, after all, the whole point of our pilgrimage through Lent, through Good Friday to Easter Sunday. What does Jesus offer when we experience our sufferings? The power of God to hold us firm, to give us strength and courage, and to see us through it. So it does change a bit the face of suffering for us in this life. The resurrection does, and it changes also the face of death. as a reality, death remains. Each one of us here today is going to have to deal with it one day. Perhaps you remember the preacher who was hammering that at his congregation, saying, everyone in this congregation here is going to die. And one man broke out in laughter. And the minister stopped, interrupted to say, how could you possibly do that? That's a shame. The man said, what do you mean? I'm not a member of this congregation. Well, most of you are. And each of us will have to face it one day, but in the light of the resurrection, it ceases to be the specter that it was. The sting, Paul says, has been withdrawn. The sting of fear and uncertainty. Dr. Jerome Groopman of Harvard Medical School relates his experience with the dying in his new volume entitled The Anatomy of Hope. In it, he speaks of Barbara, to whom he had to break the news that he knew of no medicines he could give her that would help her now. We sat in heavy silence. Barbara shook her head, though, and said, no, Jerry, you do have something to give. You have the medicine of friendship. The next day when I visited, Barbara's minister was there. He stood and introduced himself as Bill Babcock, and then began to excuse himself. Stay, said Barbara in a voice that left no room for disagreement. Dr. Groopman is here on a social visit, just like you. I can come back later, I said. Three's hardly a crowd, Barbara said in the same definitive tone. Anyway, we weren't discussing state secrets, just the hymns I once sung at my funeral. Her voice was even. She could have said they were discussing the menu for next week's church supper. I sat down, as did Reverend Babcock. The eulogies must be limited to 5 minutes, not a minute more, Barbara said. If there's one thing I can't abide, it's those endless droning eulogies heaping on praise and not mentioning the juicy sins that everybody really wants to hear about. Well, Reverend Babcock shook his head in mock dismay. For months, Barbara had sustained a determined spirit. Now that she knew the grim reality of her condition, I expected to see a change, but she seemed undeterred. I wondered if it would prove to be a facade that would ultimately crack, or was it actually possible to face fear and death with such equanimity? The idea even left me dumbfounded. So, are you afraid? I asked her one other evening as the last rays of the sun were setting. You know, not really, not as much as I thought I might be. I moved my chair closer to her bed. Why do you think that is? I'm not entirely sure. I have strange, comforting thoughts. Barbara shifted onto her side so she could see me. When the fear starts to creep up on me, I conjure the idea that millions and millions of people have passed away before me, and millions more will pass away after I do. And then I think my parents have each died. I guess they did it. I guess I can. She paused. As Ecclesiastes says, everything has its season, a time to be born and a time to die. And then as a Christian, I believe in hereafter, that we all return to God and to one another. What form that takes, no one can really say. Then she grinned. It's not like I'm expecting to get on the up escalator and be delivered to paradise and find angels there playing harps. I was never one for airy music anyway. So you see, out of the conviction of this day that death is not destruction, annihilation, that it has no victory over us, we too may find the strength when it does come to deal with it with such courage and equanimity. It has a new face for us here and now. The word of this day changes for us the face of suffering. The word of this day changes for us the face of death. The word of this day changes for me the face of those I love and those I ought to love. From the word of this day, if I remember it, I look into the face of wife and mother and children and grandchildren and friends, and yes, even the person in need that I'm inclined to pass by. I look into their faces in a different way. I see their faces in the light of eternity, in the light of the reality that we shall be together forever. Seems to me that those who live only for the fleeting days, the temporary days we can enjoy here, cannot avoid, over the years as they fly by, cannot avoid a certain melancholy as one by one the friends disappear. Thomas More wrote, "When I remember the friends so linked together I've seen around me fall like leaves in wintry weather, I feel like one alone, some banquet hall deserted, whose lights are fled, whose garlands dead, and all but I departed." I believe in the resurrection because I believe in the love that I see in Jesus on his cross. There I know that God is love, and I also know that I, with a much less perfect love, want to keep those alive whom I do love. So I don't let my friends die. I work to keep them alive in my memory, in my heart, long after I've stopped seeing them. For whatever reason, God allows a world where a man dies jogging in the prime of life and a woman dies in a crash on the way to visit her family. But I believe, and if I did not believe this, I would not believe in a loving God, that God is not satisfied with such a situation. God will not let death win. As the years fly by, I lose friend after friend. Above all else, Easter is the promise that someday I will get my friends back. I have a fantasy that it's a little like arriving at Terminal 5 at O'Hare Airport after coming on a long plane flight from Europe. At first there is that weary tunnel into the airport and then that long, long hallway. But then you arrive at the passport controls and there's nobody there. And there's no baggage on the belts either. And then I walk the green lane and those automatic doors open, and instead of a huge bunch of strangers looking right by me, I see a host of friends, boyhood buddies, colleagues, coaches, professors, cousins, the whole extended family, and somewhere in the midst, Jesus saying with a smile, "Welcome home," and my dad there too saying, "I hope you brought some pictures." Another man sits in church and reflects. At the altar, the overweight parson, not a member of this congregation, is doing something or other with the bread as his assistant stands by with the wine. In the pews, the congregation sits more or less patiently waiting. The church is quiet. Outside, a bird starts singing. It's nothing special, only a handful of notes in different directions. Then a pause, then a trill or two, a chirp, warming up for the business of the day, but it's enough. The parson and his assistant and the usual gathering of senior citizens and parents and teenagers are not alone in whatever they think they're doing. And maybe the bird is there to remind them of that. In its own slapdash way, the bird has a part in it too. Angels and archangels and all the company of heaven, says the old prayer book. Maybe we ought to believe it. Angels and archangels, cherubim and seraphim, they're all in the act with us. It must be a little like the great sound and light at Versailles when all the fountains are turned on at once and the night is ablaze with fireworks. Must sound a little like the last movement of Beethoven's choral symphony or the Atlantic in a gale. And all the company of heaven means everybody we've ever loved and lost, including the ones that we didn't know we loved until we lost them, or maybe didn't love at all. It means people we've never heard of. It means everyone who ever did, or at some unimaginable time in the future ever will, come together at something like this place in search of something like what is offered here. Whatever the other reasons we've come for, coming to such a place, if we come together also to give God our love, to give one another our love, then together with Gabriel and Michael and the fat parson and Sebastian pierced with arrows and the old lady whose teeth don't fit and Teresa in her ecstasy, we are the communion of saints together here and forever. And then we will sing hallelujah. Let's practice.